Will AI replace screenwriters? And how close are we to that today? Let's answer that question through an interesting lens, namely one of the best films about the art of screenwriting ever made. In the 2002 film Adaptation, directed by Spike Jonze and written by Charlie Kaufman, Nicolas Cage plays Charlie Kaufman, a screenwriter who is struggling to adapt the novel The Orchid Thief by Susan Orlean. A very meta film. The character of Charlie Kaufman and Susan Orlean are real people, and The Orchid Thief is a real book. But then there's Donald Kaufman, Charlie's twin brother, who Cage also plays and is a completely fictional character. Donald is an aspiring screenwriter who serves as a foil to Charlie, representing a more commercial and straightforward approach to filmmaking. Where Charlie suffers through his art, Donald uses formulas and common tropes, breezing his way through the process. Through the film, Donald works on a screenplay called The Three. It's a straightforward thriller in contrast to Charlie's more complex and unconventional script for The Orchid Thief. We learn a little about the plot for The Three in this scene, where Donald pitches it to Charlie. The Three is about a serial killer who is taunting a cop by sending him clues as to who his next victim is. He's holding one hostage in his, quote, creepy basement. The cop becomes obsessed with finding the killer, and during his investigation falls in love with the woman the killer is holding, even though he has never met her. Charlie is dismissive of the idea, stating that serial killers are overdone, but Donald retorts with his big twist. The killer suffers from multiple personality disorder, or, in Donald's words,
he's actually really the cop and the girl. All of them are him.
20 years after the release of Adaptation, OpenAI released ChatGPT, a large language model that quickly became a household name due to its ability to write anything from essays to song lyrics in a matter of seconds. In some ways, ChatGPT can be seen as an embodiment of Donald's approach, as it generates using algorithms and formulas, just as Donald breezes through his writing process using structure charts and cliches.
So the question is, could ChatGPT write the screenplay for Donald Kaufman's The Three?
I started by asking ChatGPT what it knew about the film Adaptation, which is a good way to start any conversation with the AI, considering it will often blatantly lie about topics it has not been trained on. In this case, I was provided with a decent Wikipedia-esque summary of the plot, so from there I began to drill down on Donald and The Three, both of which ChatGPT was able to answer accurately. Our first major stumble was when I jumped ahead and simply asked for a screenplay.
Fade in. A dark and dreary cave. We see three figures standing in the shadows. They are the three heroes, united in their quest to save the world from certain doom. We must act fast. The fate of the world.
I stopped it right there. That does not sound like a psychological thriller.
Basically, I have to teach ChatGPT the plot of The Three, or at least what we know about it.
I transcribed Donald's description of the film and fed that into ChatGPT, and then asked it to write me a 5-act breakdown of the plot. Why a 5-act breakdown? Though there are a number of screenplay systems that have been developed over the years, the two most popular are Sid Field's 3-act structure and Robert McKee's 5-act. The basic difference is Field's 3-act structure focuses on the placement of two important plot points: the inciting incident, which occurs at the end of Act 1, and the crisis, which occurs at the end of Act 2. McKee's 5-act structure focuses more on the overall development of the story and the emotional journey of the protagonist. In the film, Robert McKee is played by Brian Cox, whose method Donald embraces and uses as the basis for his own script. McKee's inclusion in the story and Donald are clearly the real Kaufman's commentary on the film industry's tendency to rely on formalistic storytelling, while at the same time he struggles to write his own screenplay, which he wants to present simply and without character arcs. But ironically, and by intention, in the end, the film Adaptation ends with character arcs and a climactic Hollywood action scene. Or, as McKee puts it,
wow them in the end. You got hit.
After a good amount of prodding, questioning, and arguing with ChatGPT, we have a legitimate plot breakdown of Donald Kaufman's The Three. The opening scene is of a convenience store being robbed. A young boy is taken hostage. Donald Cage, an off-duty detective whose marriage has fallen apart, tries to stop the robbery. He ends up shooting the robber, but the robber kills the young boy and shoots Donald as well. Donald finds himself in a coma for 2 months. Act 1. Donald returns to work after his coma, and within a few days, a horrific serial killer begins terrorizing the city. He calls himself the Spike, and his methods involve cutting the limbs off of his victims and forcing them to eat themselves before killing them. Donald also tries to make amends with his ex-wife, but their meeting does not go well. They discuss selling the home that they once shared together. Donald starts to see a therapist who helps him deal with the trauma of the convenience store shooting. In Act 2, Donald becomes obsessed with the Spike case. and when the Spike takes a woman named Susan hostage, Donald becomes desperate to save her. He begins to have vivid dreams about Susan, and despite the fact that they have never met, he feels a deep connection with her. As Donald investigates the Spike killings, he begins to uncover pieces of evidence that point towards the killer's identity. However, he is unable to make a definitive connection. In Act 3, Donald starts to receive taunting messages and clues from the Spike. The Spike begins a countdown as to when he will kill Susan. Throughout Act 3, we see Donald attending therapy sessions. In these sessions, he discusses his feelings about the trauma he experienced at the convenience store, the Spike killings, and his ongoing search for Susan. Through these sessions, the audience gains insight into Donald's inner turmoil and the guilt he feels about the young child's death. In Act 4, Donald continues his investigation, but keeps running into dead ends. At one point, he receives a tip leading to a dizzying chase scene on horseback through the city, but this proves to be another dead end. In therapy, he struggles to process the events of the Spike killings. His therapist helps him dig deeper into his feelings of guilt and shame, and it becomes clear that Donald is holding back something important. As they work through this, Donald begins to have vivid intuitions to the Spike's hideout, and it's in the neighborhood he once shared with his ex-wife. Donald is torn between his desire to find the Spike, save Susan, and his fear of what might happen if he does. With the support of his therapist, he musters up the courage to visit his old home. Donald discovers the Spike and they face off. The Spike holds Susan hostage and taunts Donald, echoing the film's opening scene. Donald is captured and tied to a chair, but as the Spike cuts into him, he is also cut. In a flash of insight, Donald suddenly realizes they are the same person. This realization forces him to confront the guilt he felt about the death of the young boy. As Donald accepts his sorrow and guilt, the Spike is defeated. Donald saves Susan, and the two exit the house. Donald turns himself in for his crimes as the Spike. As he sits in a padded cell, he begins to live out the rest of his life with Susan, who he also realizes is part of his own imagination.
Well, that's a movie, or at least it feels like one.
I wouldn't call it a great movie, but I'd put it at least on par with a number of other cop serial killer movies that have been released over the years, and probably better than a few movies that Nicolas Cage has actually been in.
But how much of that did ChatGPT write? Because the version that I presented to you was not whole cloth from the AI.
But rather one that was cut and pasted from a number of iterations, about 10 of them in total.
So truthfully, I'd say about 65 to 70%, although I did have to babysit quite a bit. It was kind of like supervising a writing partner, one that's very enthusiastic, but also very forgetful.
Falls asleep on the job, can be a little condescending, but often unintentionally comes up with some pretty great ideas.
For example, in the first iteration, ChatGPT concluded with,
"The cop is left to pick up the pieces of his life and move forward, stronger and more self-aware."
but in a later version forgot that Donald and Susan were the same person and provided this resolution.
The film ends on a hopeful note, with the cop and the victim walking away from the hideout, ready to start a new life together.
Which gave me the idea of the bittersweet happy ending.
Where I felt Donald would have to pay for his crimes as the Spike, but I didn't want to be completely nihilistic, and at least provide the guy that we spent the last 90 minutes with somewhat of a soft landing.
I mean, minus the fact that he killed a bunch of people, but whatever, Nicolas Cage would have sold it. As I mentioned, ChatGPT is very forgetful, and as I would add elements or characters into the plot,
it would often blank out on other details. That's mostly why I kept to a small cast here.
Despite those limitations, ChatGPT is a lot of fun to work with.
Is it capable of breaking an entire story on its own? Not currently, but we're early days into this technology. Writing is a fairly solitary experience, and tossing a ball around with a chatbot leads to some pretty interesting ideas. And while it is impressive, it still takes a human to flesh it all out and, well, humanize it.
If you're interested in how ChatGPT does in terms of actual scripting, that's going to be in an upcoming video, so if you're interested, please hit the like and subscribe button.